And I wanted to open with Mr. McNeely's address here, or quote here, in order to be able to formulate my own reply to Mr. McNeely and everyone else who thinks likewise. And my reply to Mr. McNeely is that I don't believe in these words, and that privacy is as important as ever before, so pay attention. Because privacy is indeed a cornerstone in a democracy. Privacy is crucial for identity formation, which is really important for us human beings. Privacy is an important part of physical protection and safety, and it is a vital component for financial transactions. I cannot think of any financial system that would work without privacy. And it is fundamental for all forms of social interaction. Sorry about that. For all forms of social interaction. Now, I do know that the importance of privacy is still a topic of debate. And I love to debate this. But for the purpose of this hour, for this session, I would like to ask you to assume the importance of privacy as a basic fact. Because the topic here is how to balance two really important concepts, which is privacy on the one hand and surveillance on the other hand. Now, these two concepts are very interesting in themselves, with very interesting features for them individually, but they also share some interesting similarities. Both of these terms are described quite often in strong opposite views. Either you're in favor of surveillance and you support it and you cherish it, or you're against it. And likewise with privacy, either you cherish the values of privacy, or you say, like Mr. Scott McNeely, that it's nothing really to care about anymore. Now, another similarity between these two concepts is that both are wicked. Now, not wicked in the sense that they will slap you in the face each time you utter these terms, but wicked in the sense that they will resist every attempt to approach these challenges or problems using the best and the most effective method of approaching engineering problems, which is divide and conquer. You know, the method by which you take a really complex and big problem and you divide it and split it in smaller and smaller pieces until you can digest the problem piece by piece and put it back together to a giant solution again. If you try to approach problems like this, wicked concepts, then you face dangers of creating new problems in neighboring domains or even in your own domain, with having the problem coming back to you again. Now, that is a very difficult thing to face, at least for the engineering world, which is used to doing the divide and conquer method. My suggestion to solving this, or to approach this, is rather than boxing in these concepts, trying to provide yet another definition, and narrowing down the concepts of surveillance, is to open up these concepts, create a richer understanding of them, and work with the concepts more actively. Like in the case of privacy, for example. So already in the introduction I mentioned that privacy has many functions. It can be used for many different purposes. Likewise, privacy is being made or constructed using many different sorts of mechanisms. We use clothes to shield our body, right? We use walls and doors to shield the views from others. But we also use body language, tone of voice. We use oral language in order to shield our privacy. We use information technologies to encrypt messages and be kept anonymous on the internet, etc., etc. There is a variety of many different mechanisms for creating privacy. And if you look at it even a bit further, privacy is extremely context-dependent and dynamic. It changes over time, both in the short and the long time scale. And as we go from this room to another room to a third room, the interpretation and meaning of privacy varies. So you can see that just by opening the lid on privacy just a little bit, there are a number of different areas to explore further in order to get a richer description of what privacy really is. And likewise, looking at the surveillance concept, there are similar ways of approaching this that can provide yet other questions than just looking on the surface level and say that surveillance is good or bad. And in this case, I need some help from David Lyon, who proposed the following way of describing surveillance, and I will read this out loud to you. Now, surveillance, according to David Lyon, is the focused, systematic, and routine attention to personal details for the purpose of influence, management, protection, or direction. Now, I love this way of describing a concept like surveillance because it's so general. And you may ask, what purpose can such a general description of a concept like surveillance do? What's the meaning of doing exactly that? It doesn't even mention IT, if you see. So using this description, we can define surveillance in flesh, in social systems, or in IT, likewise. But if you take a look at the three first terms here, the focused, the systematic, and the routine attention. Now, these are areas where computers and IT really excel. Now, this is a place where IT thrives, because this is exactly what it does. And if you look at the internet, a world of IT connected to billions of people and businesses, you can soon understand that the internet provides a playground for surveillance. And look at it from this perspective, just about anything that goes on the internet can be classified as a surveillance system. So what good would that make? Both the NSA and Google, according to this, is a surveillance system. Well, in order to think about this and to explore this even further, this definition allows us to ask even more questions about the surveillance system. Like, for example, which personal details are we paying attention to? Regarding the influence, what kind of influence are we talking about? How does it influence people and businesses, for example? The management and protection of what and how is things managed and protected? And the direction, which direction are we talking about? And we can even open for more general questions regarding the system. Like, for example, who gets to surveil who? What's the power balance between these entities? Or who defines and gets to have a say about all of this? So, I argue that by unboxing these complex terms, lifting the lid and asking even more questions about it, getting a more rich picture of it, we can start to connect the dots between what's going on here in the surveillance area and how that affects privacy, and actually vice versa. Now, Lawrence Lessig, he wrote the seminal book Code is Law almost 15 years ago now. Now, in this book, he argues that code, or IT in more general terms, is instrumental in that it regulates just about in the same way as laws and traditional regulation does. In a text from this time, Lawrence Lessig writes that the code regulates. It implements values or not. It enables freedoms or disables them. It protects privacy or promotes monitoring. People choose how the code does these things. And I find this quote really interesting. And one thing that interests me the most is that it really doesn't matter if it's an engineer or a policymaker or whoever it is that decides what the code should do. It still regulates in the same way. And even though this is 15 years ago now, code still seems to function pretty much as a filter between the values that we cherish and how it regulates. It seems really, really difficult to connect these two areas to each other. And in outlining different ways of approaching this challenge, Lessig continues by writing that the only choice is whether we collectively would have a role in their choice, and thus in determining how these values regulate, or whether collectively we would allow the coders to select our values for us. And I think that the crucial part about this, the most central thing is in determining how these values regulate and the type of role that we can play in that. So for the purpose of this discussion, it is my hope that we can assist each other and help out to actually reconnect the values to the regulation and to push our knowledge boundaries to better balance the values of privacy with the needs of surveillance. Thank you.
Thank you, Markus. We're going to keep the questions for the panel until later. And since Markus is my co-host, he won't get any hard questions from me. We will move on to Alexandrine Pirlot de Corbion from Privacy International. She is one of the advocacy officers, and she's going to give her perspective on these issues.
So just a quick introduction of Privacy International. just because for a lot of people privacy started to be an important issue last June, the day after the revelations, and that's when privacy became important for everyone, and that's when it became an issue. Privacy International has been working for about 30 years, so privacy is not a new issue, it's not a new concern, it's been on the table for a very long time. It's just now the discourse has changed. And also to reflect on some of the comments this morning that I find a bit worrying about privacy only being a concern in the West, that for people that don't access or desperately trying to access the internet, people are willing to give up their privacy because they don't care about it and they don't value it. We work with an amazing network of more than 25 organizations in 24 countries across the world, and I think that clearly reflects that privacy is important and is a global issue for all. So reflecting on the issue that we're discussing today, and whilst Privacy International's focus has been a lot on the state responsibility, I wanted to acknowledge at the beginning that we do acknowledge and are concerned by the role of private actors in this debate as well, in the way they're designing, their role in designing, developing, and deploying technologies which enable and provide communications, which are all legitimate aims and purposes, but then looking also at the concerns when they interact and cooperate with the state for surveillance purposes, but also looking specifically at the private sector, so actors whose goal and aim is to provide, design, and sell surveillance equipment. So these are three actors that we've been engaging in. So maybe my position today is to clarify a little bit the debate that we're having today about having to strike a balance between privacy and security. I just want to state a few facts before going into that. So governments, as we all know, have an obligation to respect and enforce the rights of individuals, the fundamental rights and freedoms, and those rights and freedoms can only be circumvented in strict circumstances. The obvious ones are for national security, public safety, etc., which are all in accordance with the law. The other fact that we have to acknowledge as we discuss this issue is that governments also have a responsibility to protect all of their citizens, those present on their territory, and as PI is arguing increasingly, is to include those within their effective control. So looking at a more expansive view of jurisdiction, especially when we talk about digital communications. So for this purpose and this objective that I've just mentioned about the responsibility of the state to protect rights, but also to protect the individuals, that's what we call lawful, legitimate, proportionate, and necessary surveillance. That is what is carried out by the state, by its institution, for law enforcement purposes, in accordance with the rule of law, following strict legal procedures, including the requirement for judicial warrants and due process, amongst others. Those activities so the activities that restrict privacy, including communication surveillance, can only be justified when they are prescribed by law with a necessary legitimate aim and are proportionate to the aim that is pursued by that authority. It is about the enforcement of checks and balances, which we discussed this morning, that are imposed on those different actors. But our argument is everything I've just mentioned, the need to protect citizens and their rights, has nothing to do with what we're concerned about today, which is mass surveillance. That is the difference. We shouldn't be having this debate between striking a balance between privacy and security within the mass surveillance debate. Mass surveillance is never proportionate or necessary. It's never in respect with the rule of law. It's inherently disproportionate interference with the human rights. It can lead to various results, and I won't go into all of them in detail, but to name some of them, it can fuel further arbitrary and discrimination practices and policies. It provides non-justified and unlawful limitations of the enjoyment of other rights. And one of the key issues that is emerging is it results to arbitrary profiling which results in the discriminatory analysis of the data that emerges from that surveillance. I mean, privacy is an issue that's really come up in different international forums now, specifically on the striking a balance between security and privacy. And I just wanted to read out a quote from Navi Pillay, which really summarizes basically everything I've just said. So this was on the 12th of June 2013, last year. So after the revelations, she said that the High Commission while concerns about national security and criminal activity may justify the exceptional and narrowly tailored use of surveillance programs, surveillance without adequate safeguards to protect the right to privacy actually risk impacting negatively on the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Those who are carrying out and conducting mass surveillance programs have tried to make the case that it's justified to fulfill their obligation to protect their citizens, to combat terrorism. But in our opinion, they haven't made a good enough case. With the information we know now, they have failed to convince us. And so they've had to resort to secret arrangements rather than transparent and public arrangements. So with the information we have now, we refute the argument that less privacy is more security. In December 2013, when the White House review panel questioned NSA representatives as to whether the recent revelation, as to whether mass surveillance programs had actually stopped any terrorist attacks that might have been really big, whatever big actually meant, the answer was no. So I'm not saying that in the future it might not, and there might be evidence in the future that it can be justified, proportional, and legitimate for the aim, but with the information we have now, that's not the case. But we've seen as well is that the checks and balances either don't exist, or if they exist, they're only in theory and they're not enforced. And as well, there's no relevant authority to oversee their legitimate and efficient enforcement. So I'm not going to go into details. I think some of you might know about the 13 principles that were put forward by a few civil society organizations last year, to which more than 400 people have signed up, organizations have signed up, and numerous individuals. But they basically line out what the basic principles should be for reviewing current surveillance practices. So the last point I want to make, which I think is a point that's been undervalued in this debate, and it's important to all of us who are engaging with actors who are working on these issues, putting their lives at risk to defend others, to defend human rights, and who use the internet and who are engaged in all of these forums, is the way mass surveillance programs have made us vulnerable and not secure or safe on a day-to-day basis. This is the point that PI is trying to make by suing GCHQ, so this is the British Intelligence Services Agency. So we're suing them for the hacking activities that they carry out on our devices. Under the European Court of Human Rights, any interference with privacy or freedom of expression must be prescribed by law and necessary in a democratic society. Currently, GCHQ's intrusion activities fail both tests. The other one I wanted to bring up is the issue of 0 days. By not responding rapidly, or at least informing users of 0 days, governments are potentially putting us at risk in very vulnerable positions to exposing our devices. And if you use your devices the way I do now, it means my life, my private life, my personal relationship, my professional life as well. So they're putting and exposing that to malicious individuals and organizations. The justification given by authorities for mass surveillance programs is on the basis, supposedly, of national security and protecting individuals. But for me, that gives a false sense of security. If I'm going to give up some of my rights in return for protection, I would hope that that's actually the real reason. Because at the moment, it gives individuals a false sense that they are safe and protected. Before finishing, I'm going to throw out two issues that might come up in the discussion and that might interest some of you. The issue of jurisdiction that I touched upon earlier. We need to start having discussions of a very expansive understanding of what jurisdiction means, because users don't decide which routes or in which countries their data flows. So if the obligations of state to protect is only to protect those in their territory, then we're not starting at the right point. The other one is, I've talked a lot about digital communication surveillance and mass surveillance, but just bringing up some of the issues that Markus was raising. I mean, there are broader surveillance issues. Any program that is about the amassment of personal data in centralized databases, be it SIM cards, biometrics through electoral registries, visas, passports, e-health, m-health, m-transfers, or even as well in consideration with delivery of aid and big data for development that you were discussing before. I mean, all these tools can and have been used for surveillance purposes and should form part of this debate as well.
Thank you. I have one small question before we move on. Would the illegitimacy of mass surveillance change if there was a greater trust in governments that they were doing, they were not doing a disservice?
I'm going to talk in my own capacity.
Of course.
I don't think they would. How can you justify the amassment of data of thousands, if not billions of people, for possibly an incident that would impact, only if the intelligence services were doing their jobs properly, they would know the targeted, who's the target, when, how, and would have to limit the surveillance to a certain group of people based on genuine and direct suspicion or evidence, rather than imposing it on society as a whole and the idea of just in case something might come up.
All right. We are moving on to David Mothander, who is the Nordic Policy Council for Google.
Yes. I had prepared something entirely different, but I have another reflection, which given the discussion I overheard this morning, I'd like to sort of see if anybody debates on that. I can see that the notion of privacy is basically applied equally if we're talking about government surveillance as well as commercial use or the likes of Google and Facebook. And I don't really see it that way, because when it comes to the definition of privacy in the world where I belong, I was just asked in the previous panel, what does Google collect, for what purposes, what if Steve Ballmer became the CEO of Google, all of these questions about what we do. And I think the answers to those questions are absolutely vital in order to create a trust for the services that we provide. But not only that, also for users to be able to assess what is the perimeter of their definition of their own privacy. So the transparency is absolutely vital in order for us all to assess what is privacy in a digital concept. Now, taking the step over to government surveillance, it lies in the nature of government surveillance that there will be no transparency. We will never know what they collect, for what purposes, and if Steve Ballmer becomes the CEO of the military secret service. It lies in the nature of their job. There will be democratic institutions there to secure the rule of law and transparency and proportionality and all that. But that will still be held away from us, so we will not be able to assess that. So in a way, I think the privacy in the normal world will very much be defined by our own definition and our own knowledge, while privacy in the world of surveillance will be defined by somebody else. And that, to me at least, is a fundamental difference, and therefore I don't really share the sort of, even though I really love the cool slides you had, I don't really share the definition. That's all.
All right. We're changing the speaker system. So I'm going to give a few, before the audience starts asking questions, I'm going to give a few control questions to you. How many here represent NGOs? Governments? Corporations? Academia? All right, so we have an activist, NGO-heavy audience. Go figure. I'm going to send out an open question as well to reflect on. What does it mean to protect internet freedom? And can there be a symbiotic relationship? This is probably the word that the Swedish Foreign Ministry use. A symbiotic relationship between security and privacy. Right. I saw a question over there. Is there a audience mic? All right.
So yeah, there's something I wanted to say in response to the question you asked her, and that's about this trust in governments. I think it's really wrong to have a trust in governments, because I think what keeps democracy healthy is this basic distrust in government. So it's not really about the question, do I trust the people from the government in this room or whatever, but it is about this fundamental distrust that should be a part of lawmaking and a part of actually our democratic system should be built on the notion of a basic distrust of governments, because that's what keeps democracy healthy. So that's just, I feel that needed to be said, so it's not really a question, but sorry about that.
No worries, reflections are okay. Any other reflections and questions? Over there. I'll be the mic mover around her as well. There we go.
I read from the Google's privacy policy that says that Google does not own my data. That's pretty much the main core message. They don't know who owns the data, but they say that they don't own it. My question to me is, when my website runs under an attack, why Google does not tell me who is attacking my website? Because that's my data, right? They're hitting me. So when a criminal hits my content, why Google hides who is the criminal? Or is Google have the rights to hide the criminals behind their infrastructure? Who owns the data, the attack data, the bad data? Who owns the information of who are the criminals that use the infrastructure to take content down of the internet? And why Google retains that information to the public?
Right, is David keen on answering that?
I would lie if I said I know anything about this, but my guess is that, moving on to security field, there is a lot of attacks on the internet, and Google is a very thankful target, given the fact that we're big. We have people working specifically with that, and for efficiency reasons, the transparency into that work is limited. So we need, and now I realize I sound like FRA when I say this, but we can't be entirely open with how we try to protect our users, because if we do that, then we would be vulnerable for further attacks. I don't know if that is an answer to your specific reason, but that I think is one of the perspectives that the security department would apply.
All right, we have a question down here.
Thank you, Dorothy Okello from Women of Uganda Network in Uganda. I wanted to affirm the point made by the presenter from Privacy International, that it is true that it seems like for most of the developing countries, the issue has been, let's first get access and then we worry about the rest later. But I think, just as they keep saying, we're going to leapfrog all these issues, I think that it's very important for us to understand what are the issues around surveillance, what are the issues around privacy, what should be the appropriate balance, how should our governments be responding to this issue, how should we as civil society be responding to this issue, so that as we get the access, we are also addressing the issues around privacy and internet freedoms at the same time. My concern on that is, especially among the community that we work with, for most of them, their belief would be, just as I speak with you in a room by ourselves, and that is our conversation, even when I'm sending you an email, it's me sending an email to you, that is our conversation. So there would be the expectation that what is happening in the offline world is what is happening in the online world, and we know that that is actually not the case. So I think it's very, very important in this kind of discussions and fora that yes, in the developing countries, we may not have that access yet, but it is as important for us to be discussing issues of internet freedom and security and what is it in our particular context that we should be worrying about and the messages we should be taking home and sensitizing both our governments and our populations. Thank you.
There is a question down there, or a reflection. Any comments? It doesn't have to be questions, as you've understood already.
My name is Generali Ulimwengu. I come from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and I have a couple of reflections to share with you. I think we are wasting a lot of time around this issue of surveillance and security and things like that, because as we were told this morning in the first session, there's really no security. And the internet, as far as I'm concerned, and let me declare my interest first of all. I'm interested in learning more about the internet. I'm not so savvy as some of you may be. But it's just another technological advance, just like Alfred Nobel, the explosives. That was technology that helped those who wanted to explode things, and those who wanted to manufacture things, and they would be used by the government, so it could be used by terrorists. It could be used by good people, and it could be used by bad people. Internet can be used by good, religious, and God-fearing people, as much as it can be used by scoundrels, thieves, and murderers. So it depends, as it was said this morning, and I think this has to be emphasized. It will depend on the level of civilization of those people involved in the processes around the internet. So we should not stop doing the good work that is political, that is moralistic, that is ethical around this issue, including civilizing both government, civil society, and so on and so forth. Because the pornography-bent person who used to read magazines now can get it on the internet. But also the moralistic, the ethical mind that wants to make this world a better place for children can use the internet to further his cause. So the good work of civilizing mankind cannot stop simply because we think the internet will solve everything for us, or because we think the internet is going to destroy everything for us. Thank you.
And another comment on here. And then
my name is Wojciech, I'm a journalist from Poland. You didn't ask the question about other media people here. So
sorry.
And I asked this question. I asked this question on the panel before, and it sort of touched with your answer. But so I will press you again. I think the issue of trust is now one of the most important obstacles in development of new. Like for instance, I will never ever buy a smart home integrated devices like a refrigerator and so on if I cannot trust them. But then we end this vicious circle that you can never tell me what Google does with my data. I mean, not in detail, because that's your company secret. But on the other hand, as long as I don't know it, I can trust you. And just saying, trust me, I'm good, won't cut it for me. But maybe I'm overly suspicious, but then again, tomorrow I will trust exactly with my life, boarding plane, trusting with my life with the company that operates the plane, the company that made the plane, and state institution that regulates. So somehow it is possible to overcome the trust issues, and I think that maybe airline industry is somehow an example of, because 70 years ago it was actually quite a risky thing to just take a civilian plane, because and somehow they work by trials and errors and by many disasters, just create a situation when it's safe to fly. Like, I'm not afraid of flying. I'm afraid of Google, but I'm not afraid of flying. So still I will press you. Do you have any idea how we can move forward without revealing Google's trade secrets, but also overcoming my fundamental distrust as long as I don't know? Like, is it possible to so that's my question to all of you. Is that, do you see any solution in this circle of distrust in which they cannot tell everything they do, but on the other hand they cannot expect people to trust them until they do? So thanks.
So David, trust. Well, if you sign up for a Gmail account, I promise to fly LOT next time. I am slightly concerned with the debate being so polarized, that it's either evil or it's good, and I'm also slightly concerned with the lack of progressive, future-looking visions. Because I honestly do think that even though you are not convinced yet that I am to be trusted, trust is such a hygiene factor for corporations, institutions, and other users of the internet. So I am totally convinced that it will become a competitive factor that will be developing in a way that we have to find the means to get people to trust us. Now, you're absolutely right that some of us do have our own Coca-Cola recipes that we are a bit reluctant to give up. But when we talk about user controls, we talk about transparency, and we talk about the possibility to take your stuff and walk away. Those are just means we see today of empowering the user. Now, if we see the exponential growth of the internet as we know it, with that will also come an exponential growth of possibilities. And I'm pretty sure that some of the sort of trust-creating factors lies in that development as well. So, I mean, me for one, I'm positive that you will be turned around. And I'm not just paid to say that, I do believe it.
Markus? Right, so I would like to follow up on that, because this is not the first time I experience a Google bashing on stage, sitting next to someone from Google, getting all sorts of criticism and strange questions. And I've experienced that for quite many years now, actually. But I enjoy that you actively talk about privacy. I enjoy transparency reporting, for example. But at the same time, I would kind of assume a faster pace in the direction of providing better tools for transparency and more progress towards that, because you have lots and lots of really talented engineers in your place. And connecting to the trust issue here, another thing is accountability, and in the last panel we talked about accountability. And my question here is, in order for me to hold a company accountable, what do I need as a customer in terms of information, and how can that be formatted and put in my map, so to say, for me to actually hold you accountable? Is it required that you actually do a mistake that reaches the press for me to hold you accountable? Or is that something that you actively work with? And if so, how do you do that? Because that's the pressing question for this panel, actually. How do we do it in practice? What are the steps that we can take? So there were many comments and questions in one area. But can you elaborate on your practices and what measures you try to put in place in order to do better then?
Well, I mean, there are on occasions attacks against Google users, and on some occasions we have notified those persons that there has been an attempt of breaking into your Gmail account. We haven't done it on all, but we have done it on some cases. And that depends a little bit about the situation. But that's one thing we can do. Now, I honestly think that for the majority of people, if they knew how much information they could actually obtain if they used the existing tools of us and Facebook and LinkedIn and the others, they would be surprised. And there I actually think we have our first big challenge of getting people interested in the notion of privacy and getting people to take that first, maybe uncomfortable step of actually trying to understand what you are when you are in a virtual context. That is a giant challenge for us to get our users to do this. Now, I don't think it's only our challenge. I think it lies in everybody's interest to do that. But that would be the first hurdle.
Okay, the floor, please. But I have a comment on that. But first,
and a final comment from Alexandrine as well.
Yeah. So on the trust issue, I mean, a few points on that. I mean, the idea that individuals, users, don't even know when their human rights are being violated is an issue when it comes to trust. Like, they're trusting a system, using it, and they keep on using it until they are informed that something has gone wrong. I mean, that's already too late. There has to be a process where individuals know when their data is being used, for what purpose, so that they can have their own alert systems of understanding when their rights are being violated. I think that's part of the process, and it does mean more transparency, and I understand what you're saying about protecting your own way of working and how much you reveal about your work and the security policies you have in place. But it has to be a two-way system. I mean, also, there's just a lack of communications between private companies and users. I mean, giving the example of Skype, for example, which we know was being used by various intelligence agencies to record, log, and store communications that people were having. So they have their own agreements and things like that. And when Microsoft decided to change the way it was working with Skype by changing the company it was working with, they didn't inform their users. So in terms of the trust that was broken by that revelation, nothing was done by the company to say, well, actually, we've taken the necessary steps to protect you because that's our interest. So that's also one thing to look at. And in terms of, I mean, throwing it out there is, I mean, a lot of private companies can try and do whatever they want to reassure their customers and get their trust. But when you know that intelligence services have their own back doors, you know, you start also seeing to what extent that is actually effective and protecting users.
David seems really keen on answering this, but he will have to wait for a bit. So we're going to move on to Lady in Green. We're here.
Hi there, I'm Eva from EFF. As a security professional, I just wanted to push back against the comment that we heard earlier that there is no possible way of getting security, that there's no such thing as security. I feel that we spent much of the morning putting lie to the notion that that privacy is over, but I just wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about security. The feeling that largely non-technical people have that security is impossible or that you cannot get it, much like the feeling that non-technical people have that privacy is impossible, that you cannot get it, is a lie that the people in power tell you to make you feel helpless. It is absolutely possible to get security and privacy. We cannot guarantee you 100% security and privacy from everybody all the time. But generally, there are a few fairly simple steps that you can get that will get you much of the way there. And simply looking at it and then giving up disempowers you and allows the people in power to win. The other thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly, since we're talking about sort of transparency and accountability, is transparency reports. So while we're Google bashing, how many people here have read any of Google's transparency reports? Cool. How many of you have read Facebook's transparency reports? Twitter's? Numbers getting lower. How many of you here have read the Microsoft transparency report that included the first reports about Skype? Almost no one. Well, what was particularly interesting about this report was that Microsoft's data had not yet been integrated into Skype's data, so Skype got its own sort of separate report. And Skype reported that they had turned over 0 content to governments in response to court orders, which is very much at odds with what we know in post-Snowden. And so the question that I would like to put to David, so sorry, is how can we trust the companies who are giving transparency reports? And it is great that transparency reports exist. How can we trust them to be honest in the face of just such bald-faced lying on Microsoft's part?
David, bald-faced lying.
No, it's a fair question, and it's a difficult question because maybe not on transparency reports yet, but on a lot of other cases we have tried to verify our statement with third parties. When it comes to data center security, for example, we use the services of independent validators to prove what we're saying is true. And maybe that is the next step, that when it comes to transparency reports, we will have some sort of independent audit within that. But then, again, when it comes to transparency reports, and I want to come back to what you said about that, we have been trying to push over the concept of transparency report to governments as a sort of natural next step, to get governments to adopt their own transparency reports, and we are meeting lukewarm interest, to be diplomatic. And I think that is also, I mean, there you have part of the tension which maybe some companies lean easier over to and maybe cave in, and some of us are not. As for transparency reports, until you interrupt me, they're a good example of how one company can start with something which is actually a good idea, and then the idea spreads. And I think it's a sign of the fact that privacy is becoming a competitive factor. And if it becomes a competitive, between companies, distinguishing factor, then maybe we'll see a quick take-up.
But can I follow up on that? So when will we see a transparency report from Google regarding your own activities? When will we see a transparency report that can detail to me as a customer what kind of classifiers that you're making use of? In which classes are you sorting me to your customers? And who are the customers that actually privilege from the information that you collect about me? These are issues that would assist me in coming to terms with the trust issue with Google, and it will help me to hold you accountable to your actions. If I notice that you sell advertisement to customers, which you do on a daily basis, that I do not approve of, then I can choose not to use Google because I know that you have these customers, for example. If I see that you automatically sort me in categories that I do not approve of, I can contact you and say that, hey, I'm not this type of customer, you're sending me this. Now I must guess that, and when I guess, it often gets quite wrong. So when will I see that transparency report? Because I really like the transparency reports that you have now, but I lack them from you.
I'm pretty sure that such a report, sort of a transparency report about our algorithm from a privacy perspective.
No, I'm not asking you to reveal the algorithm.
But it is in the algorithm. You'll find those. The word you used was sorting. But this is once again a balance we will have to strike here. Can we give you that information without revealing business secrets of Google? And I think, luckily, this does not fall upon me to decide. And I think you and I can both see that, well, apparently we haven't come that far yet.
Maybe just to respond on that, I mean, I understand what your aim is, you're a business, your aim is to generate profit.
No.
To some extent.
Your shareholder.
To some extent. But can that ever be justified at the cost of violating human rights?
I don't agree that we are violating human rights, first of all. Okay. And I mean, if you feel so, I would ask you to elaborate a bit on that.
It might not be indirectly, directly, Google violate, in terms of data protection issues, there are some, like we've seen with eBay as well, like leaks of information, vulnerabilities in systems. They allow people to access information, personal information. But indirectly as well, by transferring to a third party personal data about your users, there is a risk as well on that level.
Sorry about going down on the details. We have not leaked information about our users. We have not sold information about our users. We don't share it with third parties. I want to get that straight, because there might be other cases in the industry where this has happened, but not for Google at least. Because going back to, if that were to happen, it would deepen the problem we have with trust, the problem we already have now. So it's a hygiene factor for a company like Google. And the importance of maintaining the trust and privacy of users gets even more important the bigger you get. I mean, I think Google is very humble to the fact that the trust and the privacy of users is number one, if you were to ask us to prioritize that. And going back to that sort of notion that we're just another money-grabbing American big corporation, I know you guys are going to laugh now, but there are actually companies that are in this business because they are curious. We are, from the beginning, an academic project which was not come up to make money, but rather to see if it was possible to make the world's information searchable and available for everyone. Now, yes, we do make a lot of money. I fully appreciate that. but it's not the sort of evil Knievel money-grabbing company. There are other wills on the world as well. And I think if you look at Google, we are an innovative company, and not all of that innovation is motivated by sheer greedy capitalism.
moving on from Google, hopefully, and do reflect on, I mean, one of the important discussion is government surveillance as well, and how we can balance privacy against that kind of surveillance. So we're not just Google bashing. There's a question in the back, and then there's a question up here in the front.
Okay, Quitéria, Youth Parliament of Mozambique. I'm aware of the need of the balancing between the privacy and security. But for me, the problem is that in developing countries such as my country, Mozambique, we have, for example, now a project of law of electronic transactions that was sent to the parliament, and this law is aimed to criminalize all the person that send SMSs, emails, or any publication on internet that they consider insultuous for government or for that, like, put at risk the national security, state security. But the problem is that how is defined the state security? What are the limits of this state security, and who really monitors the government to see that the freedom of expression and all the rights are not violated in the name of national security or state security? Because we have been, this project of law was just sent after a demonstration that was mobilized through internet and SMSs that joined more than 5,000 persons because of government decisions, and so internet have been using as a tool of civic engagement. So how can we define it and really make sure that civil rights are being protected in this situation? So what are the steps that we can use to move forward? Thank you.
All right.
Can I say something about that?
Of course.
I think one of the bits that we have been bad, and I say we as in all of us in this room, is proving beyond doubt the value of the open and free internet. I mean, we're all familiar with how the open and free internet was an instrument in the democratic operations in the Arabic world, and we can all foresee the need to have Twitter and communication links, but there's still sort of the non-negotiable evidence that proves that the open and free internet is good for everyone. And I think we are moving towards actually doing that, because if you look at the research being done now, of the links between economic and social progression and the open internet, the evidence is actually quite staggering. It's very clear that open and free internet countries are doing better when it comes to economic growth, innovation, and social progress. And once that is proven, I think we will have a very strong argument against those governments who are thinking about limiting that. And unfortunately, you always need to go down to the money and prove that it's worth money. But if we can do that, then I think we'll have a strong argument.
We're going to have a final reflection here. Okay. And keep your questions in mind and keep the discussion going. It's going to be a very interesting seminar here right after us, where we're going to talk about the technical aspects of trying to circumvent surveillance, among other things. And then I'm going to ask you to give a short, with a emphasis on short, reflection on what we've discussed.
Thank you. I just want to respond to the gentleman from Dar es Salaam earlier. I'm very happy that you're here and that you expressed your opinion, because it fundamentally disturbs me. I fundamentally disagree with the idea that the internet is like dynamite. The problem with dynamite is if you use it for nefarious purposes, it still works wonderfully. With the internet is not just a technology, it's also a collection of norms and procedures and protocols and all that sort of stuff. And if we fuck it up in how we come up, which norms and protocols we choose, we fundamentally break the internet. And that for me is why this is so crucial that we actually get this right. And I hope you come to realize that the work we do here is, if we break the internet, we no longer have a vehicle for ambitions and for our hopes and so on. So this to me is I'm very happy that you expressed your opinion, but I'm also very it's very disconcerting to me. That was my point.
So, short final reflection, first from David, then Alexandrine, and then Markus.
To sort of give both hope and despair, to use the words of Andrew McAfee from MIT, when he talks about the digital revolution or the digital evolution. We ain't seen nothing yet.
Short and sweet. Alexandrine?
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe highlight two of the issues that came through. So I focused a lot on the state surveillance, and that's definitely something that needs to be addressed now rather than later, and for reviews and check and balances to be efficient, adequate to the world in which we're engaging in. And maybe the aspect of the private sector and responsibilities on that side. There's a lot of work that's been done on the violation of issues of linked to the environment and extractive industry and things like that. We need to see that debate now brought to the private sector and surveillance sector and the impact on human rights. So there's a two-front to work on so that we can ensure the privacy of individuals and the protection of their personal data.
Right, Markus.
Right, so I want to end with a positive comment as well. I was one of the people in the last session who raised my hands for both of the questions. Is there a future in big data, and are you worried about big data? And I raised my hands in both questions. Because I really believe that we have a positive future ahead of us. Most of what we do on the internet brings good things. But still, I think that the discussion that we've had today proves that we will need yet another endless range of meetings in order to come to terms with how to balance the surveillance against privacy, because we still have a lot of work to do.
Right, and since we are at a meeting, like I said, keep the discussion in mind, keep it going throughout the evening and the night and tomorrow. Stick around for the next part in this interesting dichotomy and discussion, which Wilhelm over there will be hosting. And thank you very much for participating.